In conjunction with our centennial celebration, we've been looking back over the last 100 years of history, trying to identify some of the key foundational pieces of our legacy. And as we said in week one, each of those pieces kind of acts as a leg on a stool that is upholding who and what we are as a church. And this is kind of the way we've said it. Our story as a people of faith is all about transformational encounters with Jesus. That's the Christ component. Life-giving relationships with each other, that's the community component, and acts of ministry and service within the church and to the world around us, that is the compassion component. We've talked in detail about the Jesus encounters, and last week we talked in detail about the life-giving relationship piece. But today we need to spend some time zeroing in on the serving piece. I want you to see how compassionate serving has shaped our history and is absolutely essential as we move into our future. You've often heard me mention the couple, Oscar and Lenny Rowland. Oscar has already gone on to heaven, been promoted into heaven. Lenny was in the last service. She was at the 8:45 service. They are a part of a group of people that kept the doors of this church open when it almost closed decades ago. There were about 10 or 11, 12 of them left. And Oscar and Lenny will be quick to tell you it wasn't them, but I will tell you they were the leaders of a group of lay people who did not allow the doors of this church to close for us to be here today. It was hard to find a pastor. Saxe was a hard place. They couldn't afford to pay much. When they did get a pastor, they didn't stay long, and it left it to Oscar and Lenny to clean and mow and teach Sunday school and lead worship and do everything. And just the first Sunday of February, Lenny came to Haley and I after the service when she saw the timeline, and she was in tears, and she said, Oscar and I could have never believed when we were fighting to keep the light bill paid that one day all these people would be coming to our church. And she said, it's so humbling to be a little part. In a way to honor Oscar and Lenny, a few years ago, our church established a scholarship for students that had a heart to go into ministry, that were disadvantaged in one way, but they had studied to show themselves approved, but they were disadvantaged in one way or another, and they wanted to go serve in a hard place like Saxe was when Oscar and Lenny were serving the way they did years ago. And so we created the Oscar and Lenny Rowland Honorary Scholarship. And this year, it's been given many times, but this year it was given to a young Native American girl from a reservation in Arizona as a call of God on her life, and she was the recipient, and it provided an opportunity for her to get an education. It's embodying the servant heart they showed. Selfless serving has been and is the lifeblood of our church. It's the only reason we exist today. And if we hope to maintain any sense of spiritual vitality in the future, it will be determined by how we serve each other within the church and how we serve the world outside the church. But the cultural headwinds are fighting against the serving part of our DNA. And those headwinds are stronger than they've ever been. Serving is not the default of human nature. Selfishness is. And sadly, selfishness not serving is the rule of the day. People want what they want for them. And that selfishness is undermining family relationships, whether it be between spouses or among siblings, as people battle over their own wills and their own ways. And when it comes to church, most people look for a church not for church service, but how the church can serve us. Too often we come asking, what am I going to get out of it? Instead of what do I have to offer it? That's the way people church shop, like a consumer shopping for religious goods and services. They're looking for the next place that'll give them the biggest return on their time investments. Most people don't come looking for a place to give of themselves and to make a difference. The question most often is, where can I go to have my needs met? Because our first priority is not service, but how are they going to serve me? Now that's fine if you're checking into a hotel, but when it comes to God's kingdom and His economy and being His follower and your relationship with His church, it's not about being a consumer. It's about being a contributor. How are you going to make a difference with your time, your talent, and your treasure? And it's less for the church's sake and more for yours. In God's economy, He wired us to grow spiritually in direct proportion to the way we serve. We serve little, we grow little. We serve much, we grow much. But I guess it's hard not to be selfish in today's culture because we live in a day of celebrity. Everybody wants their 15 minutes in front of the camera. We've even created a diplomatic term to make it sound a little better. We call it an influencer. And basically what it means is a person seeks out celebrity, builds a following, and then finds a way to monetize that following. Everybody wants celebrity. Everybody wants to be on top. It's harder today than ever to find somebody with a servant's heart that has genuine and authentic motives. Self-glory, self-reliance, and self-sufficiency is the order of the day. The masses, even the Christian masses, are pursuing power, possessions, prestige, and position. We're driven by self-interest, and the underlying question we're asking as we approach anything is, what am I going to get out of this? And while we may never say it out loud, the narrative of the day is, what's in it for me? Now, don't misunderstand me. There are personal benefits to serving. And in God's economy, in your work and in your career, a good day's work deserves a good day's pay. But when you read the scripture, when you understand the heart of God, the desire He has for His people is that they possess a genuine heart of serving, whether it's in their home, in their offices, or at the church. And there's nowhere in the Bible this becomes any clearer than in Mark chapter 10. And while you find your place there, let me remind you, all year long, we've been looking to topics that Jesus exemplified in His earthly life. We want to learn from the patterns and the priorities and the routines of His life. We've learned how He prayed and fasted. We learned how He honored God by walking in what is known as the fear of the Lord. We learned how He managed time, how He managed relationship. But the one we're going to talk about today may be the most significant of all of them. Jesus embodied the heart of a servant, which means it's impossible to be a fully surrendered follower of Christ and not do the same. Look at Mark 10, verse 35. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to Him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do us a favor. What is your request? He asked. They replied, when you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left. But Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must be baptized with? Now, if you're a parent, you know exactly what's going on here. You understand the context surrounding this question because your kids have come to you exactly the same way James and John are coming to Jesus. I know mine have. Dad, do you love me? Sure I do. Then will you do me a favor? That's a manipulative setup, okay? And that's exactly what's happening right here in this passage. Now, on the surface, it seems like an innocent question. Will you do us a favor? But when Jesus asked them to clarify their request, you see their real heart. And their real heart is in the same place as a lot of ours. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of all of this? It becomes about serve us rather than service towards God and His purposes in the world. They come right out and ask Him to make them great. They boldly ask what our culture is asking for: celebrity, power, position, and prestige. And to fully understand their total lack of self-awareness and to grasp just how offensive their heart is in this moment to the heart of God, you only have to look at the previous 3 verses. We're not going to read them, but glance at verse 32, 33, and 34. In those verses, Jesus is pouring out His heart about His upcoming suffering and an impending brutal death on the cross. He's describing Himself as the suffering servant who is going to give His life as a servant for them and as a servant ultimately for the purposes of God. You would have thought, as He empties His soul to them, that there would have been some compassion about what He's about to go through, that there would have been concern for Him. But no, they are so absorbed in their own self-interest, they don't even grasp the gravity of what He's saying. These are his closest friends. He's looking for companions to help shoulder the load. He needs some brothers. He's unburdening his heart. He pours out his soul about his suffering and death. And the next words out of their mouth is, will you do us a favor? Will you make us great? Will you give us a position of celebrity and influence in your kingdom? I mean, how could you be any more selfish than that? And most of us in this room know exactly what they feel like, what Jesus felt like in that moment, because it's happened to you. You're with a friend or a group of friends, and you need to open up, unburden your soul. You become vulnerable. You pour out your heart, and after you put it all out on the table, and instead of acknowledging what you just said with empathy or affirmation, they immediately make the whole conversation about them. They basically ignore everything you just said and make it about them. And here's the problem with James and John in this moment and with your friends in those moments. They're not even self-aware enough to know how self-absorbed they really are when they make it about them. Rarely does acting in self-interest look like selfishness to the person that is being selfish. It is being done in ignorance. And Jesus sees that in James and John, and he calls out their ignorance. In verse 38, but Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. This is an uninformed question. You're ignorant about what you're even asking. You're blinded to your level of self-interest and self-absorption, and you have no idea what it would mean for me to fulfill that request. It was an uninformed question. They wanted greatness. They wanted position, but they totally misunderstood the nature of God's kingdom. They are ignorant as to how God's economy works. They want position and prestige without going through the process and preparation. It's amazing to me today how many people in our world want to reach the top of anything without going through the process of getting there. They want to leverage family relationships and political clout and money or influence to arrive at a place without going through the process to be legitimately prepared for it. In verse 38 and 39, Jesus basically says to them, to get where I'm going, you're going to have to go through what I'm about to go through. Are you prepared to drink of the cup of suffering and experience the baptism of death that I have to face? And then in verse 40, he says, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared. The Father has prepared those places for those he has chosen. In other words, Jesus is saying, these positions are not mine to give. They're going to be given to those who are qualified, to those who are prepared. To get the greatness that you're asking for in the Father's kingdom, it doesn't come to you because you ask for it. It comes to you because you are prepared for it. If you want any level of significance in anything you pursue, it takes preparation. If you're seeking greatness at your office or career path, nobody's going to make you the head of the company because you walk in and ask for it. You got to get an education or fill out difficult internships, or some level of credible experience has to be gained. You got to be qualified for it and prepared for it. Jesus is the suffering servant in these verses on his way to the cross. He's explaining what that looks like. And James and John come with some self-absorbed motives, asking for greatness, asking for something that at the moment they are totally unprepared and unqualified for. Based on what comes out of their mouth, they prove the point. And this situation creates an opportunity for one of the most profound conversations of Jesus' earthly life. What unfolds in the next few verses is the foundation of the Christian life. And if you grasp it, it will totally reverse the course of your life. In verse 42, like a loving father calling his spiritual sons together, Jesus is now not just talking to James and John. You read the whole verse, the whole section there, you'll realize he's called all the disciples together because he sees something surface that is not healthy. And he says, boys, you're out of line here. If you're thinking secular terms of leadership and stuff, and you're trying to put that on my kingdom, you got all this backwards. We got to have a chat and get this fixed before I'm gone permanently. Mark 10, verse 42, so Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is probably one of the most profound things Jesus ever said. He says, greatness in the eyes of God is measured by your service to others. He says his kingdom operates on a different economy than the dog-eat-dog world of corporate life. He said, we're going to do it different in my kingdom. Greatness and promotion in the kingdom is not based on clout, political influence, economic status, or lack or greatness of talent. It's not about those things. He says, the greatest among you is the servant. Now notice, Jesus is not equating being a servant to being a nobody, because he's talking to them about the path to greatness. He's telling them how to be great. And the path to greatness is by pursuing the path of servanthood. Notice, he did not rebuke them for wanting to be great. He rebuked them for being ignorant of how to become great. There is a process. There is preparation. And it all starts with developing the heart of a servant. The path to greatness is the path of serving. Here's a great definition of servanthood. Servanthood is the attitude and action that seeks the well-being of others in accordance with the will of God. In other words, serving people is one of the greatest ways to serve God. Now let me point you to another catalytic moment in Jesus' life, and it's found in John 13. And I say catalytic because what Jesus embodies in this John 13 passage is the reason, is the catalyst for the explosion of the Christian faith around the world. This is the reason. What you see in Jesus in John 13 that was embodied by the early followers of Jesus in the first century church, what you see here is the reason Christianity went from a small little group of Jesus followers to a global movement that now encompasses over 2 billion people on the planet. And it's what's going to sustain this church into the future. I'm not going to read every verse of John 13. I'm going to skip around to give you the essence of the story. Verse 1, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. Verse 4, as an act of love, he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped the towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with a towel he had around him. Verse 12, after washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Verse 17, now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. Here's the context. In this culture, people walked in sandals on hot, dirty streets. They would come into someone's home or a place where they were going to gather for a meal. And because the tables were really low, they often said recline at a table. They often either sat on a carpet and ate with their legs crossed, or they would kneel at it was a very small table without a chair, and they would slide under the table with their legs crossed. So the cleanliness of their feet was really important. And so they would often have someone in the house, and usually the lowest person on the social pecking order. It was a child, or it was some house servant that washed everybody's feet. Shockingly, in one of his final displays of love to these men before his death, the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords gets up and grabs the servant's basin, grabs the servant's towel, and starts washing the dirty feet of carpenters, fishermen, and tax collectors. And now you got to notice this. He never once ceased being their Lord and their teacher by serving them. He did not become less because he took on the form of a servant. He was simply showing them and us what real leadership looks like and what real greatness is. In the life of Jesus and in God's economy, greatness is not measured by position, power, or celebrity. The symbol of true greatness is the servant's towel. It's not about a title, it's about the towel. Everybody in the Bible that became great was prepared by God for their greatness through servanthood. Moses learned how to lead sheep before he was ever entrusted the leading of the children of Israel. Joseph learned how to serve in Potiphar's house before he was elevated to a position of authority in Egypt. Daniel had to prove himself as a servant in Babylon before he was given authority there. Ruth told her mother-in-law, "I will serve you for the rest of my life." And in doing so, she positioned herself for a privilege of being in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Peter learned to serve with the other disciples before he ever became the head of the church. Whoever became anything great in the eyes of God became great because they learned to serve first. John Wesley said it this way: do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, for as long as you can. Jesus is not looking for fans. He's looking for followers who will follow him on this path of downward mobility, a path that will ultimately lead to a greatness that matters more than anything, and that path is through serving. The true measure of a man is not by how many people are serving him, but by how many people he is serving. As a young pastor, I'm in my 20s and pastoring my first church. We adopted an area of the jungle in South America. We're going to plant churches over the course of numbers of years in that jungle. And our motto was that we would go have medical clinics during the day, kids outreaches during the day, knock on doors. A building team would start building these cinder block churches. We would set up a tent. At night, we would have services, invite all the people from the medical clinics where our doctors and nurses had been, and all of that would be funneled into a service at night where I would preach. We'd work all day. We'd preach under the tent at night. And crowds packed that tent and strung out into the darkness of the jungle. The very first day of the very first trip, things started getting a little difficult. Now, you have to understand, these were real missions trips, okay? These were not vacations disguised as missions trips, all right? It was ridiculously hot and humid. We were building buildings out of concrete and cinder block, and we had no concrete mixer. We dug a hole in the ground and shoveled sand and gravel and concrete and hand mixed it in a hole in the ground 10 to 12 hours a day. We moved it around the building site in wheelbarrows. On the first day of the first trip, I was leading about 40 people from our church. At the end of the first day, the missionary came to me and pulled me aside and said, "We have an issue. The local pastors don't like the way you're working." And I was like, oh shoot, I have never worked so hard in my life. I mean, I'm aching and blistered, and I don't know how to turn it up anymore tomorrow. And I kind of expressed that to the missionary, and he said, no, it's not that you're not working hard enough. It's the fact that you're working. And I said, huh? He said, well, culturally here, the expectation is the top dog of any organization doesn't get involved in the common labor. And they're afraid that if the locals see you mixing concrete in this hole during the day, that they won't respect you when you preach at night. I told the missionary, all right, let me just get through today, get through the service tonight, I'll preach, let's see what happens, and then we'll get together tomorrow to determine my workload for the rest of the time here. Service that night was great. People came, packed the tent. Many lives came to Jesus. I was in a very primitive accommodation. I didn't sleep well, but it wasn't because of the primitive accommodation. I was torn. Anytime I travel out of this country, I always defer to my host. I always defer to the culture that I am there serving. The last thing I want to do is reinforce the arrogant American mentality that we've come here to take over. So I always go in and I become a servant of the culture and the people that I am there to serve. But I was torn because I have the heart to defer, and at the same time, what they're asking of me seems to fly in the face of the servant leadership that I see modeled in the Bible. So I didn't know what to do. I laid awake all night. How am I going to respond to this? Because the effectiveness of this whole initiative is dependent on the decision I make in this moment. So the next morning, our team showed up at the work site. I grabbed my shovel. I went back to the mixing hole. The missionary came over to me somewhat perturbed at my persistence to work, tried to talk me out of it. And I said, look, I was praying last night. This is what I felt led to offer you and those pastors. He had to translate for me, and I said, go tell the pastors to read John 13. And when they're finished reading John 13, ask themselves when they're done, if Jesus was here in the flesh, would he be standing around watching, or would he be getting his hands dirty? Because I'm less interested right now in cultural expectations and more interested in his expectations. And if they read John 13 and they come back and tell me that Jesus would have used his position to stand around and watch everybody else work, then I'll get out of this hole and stop. But if they read it and realize Jesus would have a shovel right along with me, then tell them to go get a shovel and get in this hole with me. I told the missionary, and I'm always worried that when I say something to I'm preaching and I'm preaching hard stuff, or I'm saying something that needs to be translated, it's not all going to get translated. You understand? They're going to say what they want. They're going to soften it a little bit. But I told him before, I said, look, the only reason, the way I was brought up, the way I understand it, the only way I have a right to preach tonight is if I'm willing to be in this hole today. If you're too high and mighty to dig, you're too unqualified to preach. I don't know what all got translated, but all I know is that little group of guys left, and I thought, well, I must have offended them. A little over an hour later, they returned in a change of clothes. They were in their work clothes. They came over and got shovels, and they waded off in the hole with me. They came back to work. Look, we went back multiple times through the years to that South American jungle, planted a lot of churches. Had a lot of medical clinics, saw a lot of people come to Jesus. But looking back, maybe the greatest long-term investment was the shift away from church leadership, from a secular understanding of leadership to a Christ-centered perspective where the leader is the lead servant carrying the towel. In the kingdom of God, it's not about titles. It's about towels. Leaning over the shovel that day, I challenged pastors from the Word, John 13. I feel led to do the same with you today. We're headed into our most spiritually fruitful time of the year. In the weeks leading up to Easter and on Easter weekend, hundreds of people are going to put their faith in Jesus Christ. I mean, this is going to happen over the next few weeks. You have an opportunity to be personally involved in that life change. Here's another challenge, though. In the next few weeks, depending on the completion date of our Wiley campus, I mean, it could happen within 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We're waiting on an occupancy permit and some last bows to be put on that building before we start having some preview services over there. When that happens, hundreds of people are leaving this campus to be a part of the launch team of the Wiley campus. That means some of the key leaders that have served this campus for years, that have been the backbone of our dream team, are going to be here one Sunday, and then they're going to be gone for good to Wiley. Which means if we don't fill their shoes, if somebody doesn't pick up a shovel or take up the towel, there are going to be a lot of empty holes and gaps over the next few weeks as we head into Easter. I believe with all my heart that planning the campus in Wiley is being done at God's request. And because I believe it's His will, this is the way I prayed. God, will you see the hundreds of people we're sending to the mission field of Wiley, Texas? Will you see them as seeds? And every seed we sow, will you give us 10 back here in Saxe in their place? Let it be the law of the harvest, supernatural increase. I believe you may be some of that seed, the harvest on that seed. Here's the challenge for some of you. You didn't grow up in church, or you came from smaller churches where you had to do everything. And you walked into this church and there's people running around everywhere, and the first thing you thought in your head is, they don't need me. That could not be further from the truth. And the need is greater now than it's ever been. But listen to me. The plea I'm making to you today to serve is not made out of desperation. We're not going off the air. We're not going out of business. If people choose to sit, soak, and sour for the rest of their lives, we're going to make it. In the church, typically 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And I will tell you, we have bucked that trend here. That we have not been the norm. We have shattered those expectations, and I pray we keep doing so. I want you to know the appeal today, the opportunity today is not motivated selfishly for the church. I really believe long term it's for your benefit. In God's economy, you can't grow and become the spiritually mature person that God wants you to grow into without a place to serve. It's just the way God designed you and the way He designed His church. I'm not asking you to make a lifelong commitment. I'm asking you to commit through Easter Sunday. Get plugged in and serve through Easter. Yeah, the need is greater than Easter. My hope is that you got a close-ended commitment. You can walk after Easter. My hope is that you get so addicted to change lives, you want to keep carrying the towel when Easter is over. But all I'm asking is through Easter.
Hey, thank you for watching the Northplace Church YouTube channel. If today's message impacted you, we would love for you to join our Northplace from Any Place family so that we can connect with you and help you take the next steps in your relationship with Jesus. Subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any of the content available to you. And if you would like to partner with us in furthering the mission of God through Northplace Church, click the link for ways to give and be a part of what is happening here at Northplace. I'm so glad that you joined us today, and I look forward to seeing you right back here next week.